All right. So it is 12 o'clock and time for the first forestry lunch break. Thank you everybody for joining me here today. This is a little bit of an experiment, trying this webinar mini series here. Thought it'd be interesting to try bite-sized lessons for larger topics like tree planting instead of having one long 3-hour webinar. So I really appreciate you joining me along for the experiment. I'd love to hear your thoughts down the line at the end of the week on what you think about this format for other potential topics, as well as other topics you'd like to see cover. But before we get to that, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Patrick Shults. I'm the Extension Forester for Washington State University in Southwest Washington. So, this webinar series may be a little bit West Side focused for those of you that are joining from east of the mountains, but the principles should apply more or less. Obviously, I know it's not tree planting season in Eastern Washington right now, but when the time is right, what you learned here will hopefully still be useful. So, a couple of logistical things to cover here in case this is your first webinar with WSU or first Zoom webinar at all. I imagine it's probably not for most of you. You are going to be muted. Obviously, you're muted now. You're not able to share your screen or your video either. But the way that you can interact is by typing into the chat box, and you should be able to see the option for opening the chat on the menu bar on your screen there. And so you're highly encouraged to submit questions there. I will be kind of answering them on the fly as we go, and I'll also be able to take questions to the end. So this is only supposed to go from 12 to 12:30, but I'll be, if people want to hang out and ask questions afterwards, I can hang out for a little while as well. So last bit here is these are going to be recorded. So I'll send links to those later on. We had about 80 people sign up for this. We've got about 23 in right now. A lot of people end up just watching the recordings, which is totally fine. So I'll be sending those links to you, but I hope you'll be joining me throughout the week as well, because there's certainly something to being able to interact, and we've got a lot of good speakers coming up. So today we're going to be talking about choosing your trees. This is your first step in the tree planting process, and certainly one of the most important steps. Obviously, you are picking trees that are going to be in the ground for the decades to come. So it's something that you don't want to do lightly. You definitely want to put thought into it. And we're going to cover all of the, and many of the most important considerations that you'll have to run through before you actually go about planting any of your trees. And just as a heads up, I'm sure you've all seen the schedule for this week. So tomorrow we'll be talking about site prep with Matt from the DNR. The following day we'll be talking about actually planting, proper tree planting, those kinds of things. So if you ask a question that I think might be better answered by Matt or some of the other DNR folks talking later in the week, I may just kick that can. So I hope you won't be offended, but I'll encourage you to keep joining us throughout the week, and you can get your question answered one way or another. Okay. So moving on, the first question you're going to have to ask yourself when you're, thinking about planting trees is why? What are you trying to accomplish here? For many people, it's reforestation, and this is unique in Washington in that it's legally mandated that if you harvest timber, you reforest within 3 years at a minimum of 190 trees per acre, which we'll talk about a little more about later. So this is essentially just replacing trees that you cut down. There's restoration projects, which in a lot of ways is replacing trees that should be there, but they were not there. So a lot of this happens around riparian areas, the focus being on biodiversity, wildlife habitat, improving stream quality, particularly temperature for fish habitat. So I've seen quite a few people doing projects like this, and a lot of conservation districts in the area, especially in Southwest Washington, where salmon restoration is so important. are focusing on planting trees around riparian areas. And that'll influence what kind of trees you choose. Afforestation, this is, when we say this, what we mean is you're planting trees that otherwise would not be there. So a good example of this that I see quite often is people reforest or afforesting an abandoned pasture. You know, the land definitely used to carry trees, but hasn't in, could be 100 years. So that was what we would call an afforestation project, a little bit of crossover with restoration. But if you're interested in doing an afforestation project, getting a forest started in, their 20-acre pasture out back, there are some specific resources that may be available to you. So I would encourage you to reach out to me after this and we could talk a little more about your project and see if that's a good fit. And then there's all kinds of other reasons that you might be planting trees. There's something called underplanting, where you have an existing forest canopy, but you want to get the next cohort of trees started underneath it. So you'd be planting a lot of shade tolerant species underneath there. Spot filling, maybe you just took over, you just bought a property that was reforested, but they didn't do a very good job at it. You got a lot of mortality, so you're kind of filling in the spots. You could be trying to control erosion along a slope, or you could be trying to incorporate trees into an agricultural system. Maybe you're a farmer that wants to grow some trees in your farming systems, and that's what we would call agroforestry. So there's lots of reasons to plant trees, and you kind of have to figure out what category you fall into, because it's going to influence what you choose. And ultimately what we're asking here, though, is what do you want from your future forest? What are you trying to get out of these trees, or what service are you hoping they provide for you? That could be forest carbon. Maybe you're really hoping that down the line there would be some potential payments for small forest owners that are farming carbon. Maybe you want wood products. I mean, obviously that's a very common thing that people want from their trees. Wildlife habitat, special forest products like maple syrup, that's kind of becoming a popular thing around here. And recreation, you could have one of these, you could have a combination of these, or you could have all of the above interests in what you get from your trees. And it's things, these are things you'll have to consider when you figure out, what species you want to plant, how many species you want to plant, and what density. So we'll get into the details here a little bit more. So you know why you want to plant them, but now you got to ask, where are you planting them? And that's what we would call site. So this is the card you're dealt. You don't really get to change this. And it's the sum of the non-living factors that affect plant communities. So we're talking soil, water, elevation, aspects, temperature, precipitation, wind, among others. These are just causes, these are just a part of the site that you have, and there's really very limited amount you could do to actually influence this in the long run. So if you look at this big picture here, obviously we've got a wide landscape, and there's tons of different sites, what we would consider different sites here. On this side of the slope, you're going to have a lot more sun than on the other side. So you probably need more drought tolerant species over here. Down here in the valley, you're going to need something that tolerates, probably poor drainage. And then you can have all kinds of microsites even within these larger sites. So it can get quite complicated. You have to really know your property and understand, what goes on there in order to mitigate some potential mortality and having to go back and replant because you put something there that just doesn't get along with the site. And then you have to think about the trees. What are their silvicultural characteristics? And by that, we mean, essentially, what are their likes and dislikes? What have they evolved to handle and thrive in? What conditions are they really meant for? It's kind of like a Facebook profile for a tree. You're learning about everything that they, prefer, and also, how far outside of that they're able to go in terms of all these different silvicultural characteristics. So moisture requirements, soil type, particularly drainage, light or shade tolerance is what we would call it, vulnerability to browse, susceptibility to a variety of diseases. And especially if you're on the east side of Washington, tolerance to fire is something you have to consider. So I'm just going to go through some of the more common things that we look at in terms of silvicultural characteristics of trees. Probably the most important would be shade tolerance. And then here's some of our common native trees and where they kind of fall on that spectrum. So some people may, I hope I don't get a ton of angry emails, because even, you know, among professional foresters, there's debate on where these would actually fall on the spectrum. This is just kind of my take on it, and I'm sure another forester this would look a little bit different, but hopefully not too crazy different. So just looking at some of the far ends of the spectrum here, on the super shade tolerant species, you've got western hemlock, western red cedar, big leaf maple. These are all very common shade tolerant species to find west of the Cascades here. And really good for planting in small gaps or underplanting, as I referred to before. Of course, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got your pines and your red alder, Douglas fir. So Douglas fir in the eastern part of Washington is a little more, it behaves a little more shade tolerant than on the west side. In western Washington, Doug fir, it's not very shade tolerant. You will see it growing in sometimes like small, like quarter-acre gaps. But it grows very slowly. And what I've noticed is oftentimes around, you know, when it gets to like 15, 20 feet tall, it kind of spindles out. And it may take over that gap, but more often than not, it just can't compete with something like red cedar in that scenario that is, you know, basically evolved for that situation where it can really handle the low amount of light. Soil drainage. This is another really important question that we ask ourselves when we're looking to reforest or afforest or just plant trees on a site. This is a little more nuanced than shade tolerance. I've got quite a few asterisks here that I'd like to talk about. So for instance, Oregon white oak is a good way to start. I couldn't even figure out where to put this on the spectrum. You know, historically, it really likes drier areas, and it tends to be found in drier, well-drained sites. But that said, I have also found it, you know, growing in proximity to Oregon ash and in a dang near swamp. So it is kind of one of those trees that can go on both ends of the spectrum. It's good for those problem sites where you can't get just about anything else to grow. Similarly, ponderosa pine is interesting. So obviously east of the mountains, it's a very dry, loving species. It's drought tolerant, likes to grow on drier sites. So west of the Cascades, it behaves a little differently. There's something we call the Willamette variety, or there's also a joint base Lewis McCord variety of ponderosa pine that, you know, it can also tolerate drought, but I've also seen it grow in wetter areas, areas that actually kind of flood during the wet season. So it's kind of interesting to see it behave so differently here on the west side. And I don't know how well it does in the long term on those wetter sites, but I've seen it able to tolerate a little bit, you know, certainly more moisture than it does on the east side. And then lastly, kind of want to talk about red alder. It's very common for people to mistake red alder for just loving water so much that it would be okay with growing in a swamp. It won't. So red alder grows just about anywhere, but it won't grow well everywhere. It grows best on sites that are wet but well drained. So you get those kind of drainage slopes along hills. You get some really nice red alder growing there, but it does not like to have its feet soaked, and that's an important distinction. And of course, on the far end of the spectrum, you have something like Oregon ash that will love to sit in 6 inches of water through half of the year. So we had a quick question. Patrick, does that work the other way around? Does red cedar need shade? No, it does not need shade. You know, ideally, you know, every tree wants light. It just can tolerate shade. It can sit in an understory for a long time. It won't grow very well in that situation, obviously, but it will grow better than something like Doug fir. And then when a gap opens up over top of it, it'll just thrive in that situation and fill that gap. And that's kind of its ecological niche. Here we got one. Interesting that Oregon white oak was listed as shade intolerant. However, at the base of large pines, I have seen Oregon white oaks. Yes, yeah, so that's a good example. You know, it can tolerate a little bit of shade. I've seen Oregon white oak in those situations. But what I've also noticed is that even in those situations, they tend to be very low density forests. So there's quite a bit of light getting to the ground. But of course, everybody's got a different experience with some of these things. And I'm not certainly not questioning your take on it. Drought tolerance. This is an important one. Obviously, we've had some very dry summers in the last 5 years. And, you know, drought tolerance is going to become a more important feature of trees as we go on and deal with climate change. It's something I'll talk about a little bit later. But, you know, generally speaking, your pines are a good route to go in terms of drought tolerance. White oak, very drought tolerant. Doug fir is drought tolerant as well. It tends to be a little more drought tolerant on the east side where it's, you know, conditions are just drier. But Doug fir it's certainly a drought tolerant species for the west side as well. I have definitely noticed some drought damaged Doug fir here in Southwest Washington in the last few years. On the other end of the spectrum there, you got things like Western hemlock, Western red cedar, big leaf maple. These are all species that are taking quite a hit based on these dry summers that we've seen. And all of these species are what we would consider in decline because of that. Noble fir is interesting. So you really have to think, because this doesn't apply east of the Cascades, but in Southwest Washington, there's quite a bit of noble fir in the lowlands, and it's not native to the lowlands. So it is particularly not drought tolerant in an area where it doesn't belong. It grows in higher elevations, usually above 3,000 feet. So you're already taking it out of its element by, you know, having it in the, you know, the lowlands, and it doesn't do very well in those scenarios. I have noticed noble fir taking quite a hit from the drought, particularly because it leaves it susceptible to things like the fir engraver beetle. So got to take that into account, that noble fir is native, but it's not native to the Washington lowlands. Deer and elk browse, anybody that's planted trees knows you have to think about this. On the far end of the spectrum, you've got Western red cedar, which is very likely to be browsed. It's, you know, like candy to the deer and elk. And they know it as soon as you plant it. You know, it's raised in the best conditions in those nurseries. And so it tastes a lot better than like the volunteer cedar that they can find in the forest. So if you plant it, they will come for sure. But, you know, Doug fir, red alder, big leaf maple, Western white pine, these are all susceptible to browse as well. On the other end of the spectrum, something like Sitka spruce, they really won't touch because it's painful. In fact, there's a strategy I've seen, and I don't know how effective it actually is, to plant Sitka spruce and something like Doug fir or Western red cedar in the same hole, because then the deer will avoid it, essentially, not wanting to prick their noses on the Sitka spruce. So I think there's some research going into that and how effective that is as a strategy, and economically viable, right? Because you're paying twice as much for seedlings. So, and then you have to think about disease as well. And this is just one disease, laminated root rot. It's a very common one throughout the state, but there's a lot of different diseases, and insects tend to be species specific. So this is going to look very different if you looked at a gnosis root rot, or if you looked at, you know, certain beetles. Obviously, you have to take that into account, and you have to know what the pressures are in your area. So immune to laminated root rot would be all hardwoods and Western red cedar. Your pines do better with laminated root rot, but they're not necessarily immune. And then over on the other side here, Doug fir and your true firs, your grand fir and your noble fir, are very susceptible to laminated root rot. If you plant these trees into a pocket that has those, then they are going to get it. It's almost certain. So, Ken commented, "Hey Ken, how you doing? At least one tree farmer in Western Washington has had success with spruce and cedar planting." So that, I think it's a really promising concept. The thing that I wonder about is the finances of it, which I haven't penciled out. I'm sure it could actually be done pretty easily, but if it works, I think it'd be a really great way to protect your trees. So I want to talk about climate change. This is obviously a Oh, got another quick question. Does Extension have a Venn diagram for the various areas of the state that summarizes the best likely species candidates? Um, no, that's a good question. The problem is it has to be such a local scale because you're looking at all of these site characteristics, like I mentioned before, like aspect, and you really wouldn't be able to see that on a larger scale, like a statewide map. So there are maps that show basic plant communities, what you would find in certain areas. Like you'd find a lot more cedar, obviously, on the west side of, or sorry, Sitka spruce close to the coast than you would anywhere else in the state, and that kind of thing. But in order to really know, you have to know your localized site. And then there's even microsites inside of that. So it'd be a little bit too complicated to have like a Venn diagram for the whole state. So just to touch on climate change a little bit, it is 12:20 already, so I'm gonna speed up. You have to consider this, right? Because over the next several decades, things are going to be changing. Research suggests really what it boils down to, precipitation patterns may stay the same, more or less. We'll probably have the same amount of precipitation. We may have more rain events, bigger rain events, and then more gaps between those rain events. That's a possibility. Some maybe bigger storm events. But generally speaking, and I know this is true for the west side and the east side, is hotter, drier summers. This is what they're predicting, and we're already seeing a lot of that. And so the bottom line here is that puts a lot of stress on trees. So you really have to be focusing or thinking about in more susceptible sites, sites that are very dry, or sites with often sites with high water tables. This becomes a problem. You need to be thinking about finding some drought tolerant species there. So early on, we're already seeing, like I mentioned, declines in western red cedar, bigleaf maple, and western hemlock. This is all west of the Cascades. And that is all, it's difficult to tie it to a specific summer or tie a specific summer to climate change. But the hotter, drier summers that we've seen over the last 5 years have certainly taken a toll on these species, and we are seeing it. So that doesn't mean that these species aren't viable anymore. It's just on certain sites, they could be a little more troublesome. So like I mentioned, I've noticed here in Southwest Washington, sites that have really high water tables through part of the year, and then that water table drops in the summer, that can be really hard on western red cedar because their roots are very shallow at that point. Because they don't really like their feet soaked, so they keep all their roots up high, and then those soils dry out earlier in the year than normal, and then it's really hard on them. So certain sites may not be able to sustain certain species anymore, but that doesn't mean that we can't plant western red cedar in western Washington anymore by any means. But kind of planting more drought tolerant species on those dry sites, hedging your bets, diversifying, planting a mixture of species, seeing what does well, that's I think a really important approach for the future. The question I often get is, should we be thinking about assisted migration, which is, the idea of taking species from further south, say like Northern California, and bringing them up? I think it's too soon, and I know a lot of people in doing research on this also think it's too soon, because you have to consider that even though in 50 years, our climate here may look in Southwest Washington may look a little bit like Southwest Oregon, it still isn't there yet. And the trees that we plant here have to live here for 50 years. So it's a little bit too soon. What I have heard is selecting trees from seed zones that are further south may be the more effective route to go. Usually that means just selecting from one seed zone further south. And when you buy seedlings, they'll kind of talk you through all of this. But basically, you don't want to pick trees from a seed zone with more than a 2 degrees Celsius difference in winter low. And that's what the research has been suggesting. You can look at this tool here, the seedlot selection tool. I haven't played around with it very much, but you can look at different climate scenarios in the future and what trees might thrive in certain areas. Obviously, this is all based on models and projections, so there's a little bit of a grain of salt to be taken with it, but it is a neat little tool to play around with. And I know there's a couple questions in the chat box. I will wait till the end to get to those. I just want to make sure I cover everything I need to here with only 5 minutes left. So species mixtures, this is important, a thing to think about. You know, it can be really difficult to plant a mix of species, you know, from the start, but it can be done. I have seen it done. And there's some benefits here. You know, diversification, you're reducing your risk by having, you know, multiple species. You can mitigate damage from insects and disease because remember, a lot of those are species specific. So if you have a variety of species planted, you can often create barriers or that prevent diseases and insects from moving through a forest. Enhanced wildlife habitat, generally across the board, more diversity means better wildlife habitat. And potential for more efficient use of resources. So what this means is that because trees use resources differently, they could theoretically be complementary, and you could essentially become more efficient at how trees use resources on the site. So there was a study done down in the Columbia Gorge that looked at Doug fir and Western hemlock combinations and compared them to Doug fir and Western white pine, which is very, you know, is not as shade tolerant as Western hemlock. And what they found is that because Western hemlock is so shade tolerant and Doug fir not, these two kind of complemented each other in terms of light use. And stands with mixed Doug fir and Western hemlock produced a lot more volume compared to stands of pure Western hemlock and produced the same amount of volume as a pure Doug fir stand. Whereas combining Doug fir and Western white pine, those two ended up competing a lot and you saw reduced volume. So that's from a timber performance perspective. And if you're not really worried about timber, your options open up a little bit more. But the shade tolerance thing is really important when you're looking at planting species mixtures. Of course, another option is just to kind of manage for diversity over time. And this happens a lot, right? You plant a forest, some of them die, gaps open, you get things that move in. And so essentially what you're doing there is you're allowing those gaps and those volunteers to kind of introduce diversity. And you could even go in and create gaps too that would introduce that diversity over time. And now I'll talk about density just real briefly. Like I mentioned, the state requirement for reforestation is 190 trees per acre. That's really not that many trees. So I think that's like a 15 by 15 spacing. It's not a lot. So you're going to want to plant more than that in almost every situation. Most people plant somewhere between 300 and 500 trees per acre. Usually small forest owners I see planting on the lower end of that spectrum. But you got to think about what the potential for mortality is. You know, what are your site issues? Is it really dry? Do you have a lot of root rot? Do you have a lot of animal pressure? How are you going to be? You know, if you're not going to be there to take care of the trees, you may want to plant a little bit more in case some of them die. Are you trying to maximize timber production? If you want to do a commercial thin, then you got to plant a lot more trees at the start. And then of course, cost, you know, and including tree protection in that's going to be a factor. More trees obviously cost more money. And sometimes you have to consider if your site is going to provide some trees, you know, some volunteers. This happens a lot if people are planting red alder, I've noticed, especially in like Grays Harbor and Pacific County. You can plant, you know, 300 alder knowing that you're going to get 300 more volunteers. There's been a few situations I've seen where that's worked out. But generally speaking, more trees means more management options, but it also means more management required. So one of the things I've heard some people say is 300 trees per acre is kind of a plant and walk away. You're going to get some gaps, you're going to get some tree mortality, your timber quality is going to be a little bit lower, but you don't have to worry about it quite as much. You probably still would have to do a pre-commercial thin at some point, but it'd be a lighter thin. If you're going to plant 500 trees per acre, then you're going to be able to do a commercial thin at age 30, probably 35, but you're going to need a lot more management along the way, especially when it comes, you're going to have to really hit your thinning windows is what it comes down to prevent overstocking and stressed out trees. So that's kind of broad strokes. More trees means more options, but more management required. Okay, so I went right up to the wire there. It's 12:30. I was hoping to leave a little more time for questions, but like I said, I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions that you have. You want to type them into the chat box. I did get one from Courtney that I missed there. Oh, it doesn't actually look like a question, just a comment. Issue is that crop takes so long to mature. A choice that seems clear now may not be appropriate in 20 years. That's exactly right. So regarding climate change, you know, it's really hard. The goalposts are moving. You're trying to hit a moving target. You know, the climate now is not going to be the same as it is in 2050, or more likely 2060, 2070, when you might have a mature forest or something that you're looking at harvesting. So yeah, it is. It's a difficult thing. A question from Steve: how do WSU Extension Foresters interact with Washington State DNR? When to consult with one or the other? That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that, Steve. So Extension and DNR have a memorandum of understanding. We basically, how it works is WSU Extension provides the education and education resources, research, and all of that kind of stuff, the outreach. And DNR provides the technical assistance. So we are fortunate, and I think Ken Bevis is on. He's going to be speaking later this week. Ken is our wildlife biologist, and he goes out to landowners' properties and he tells them, you know, what they can do with their forest to manage it for better wildlife habitat. Tomorrow, we're going to hear from Matt Preventure. He's the stewardship forester for the DNR, and he visits landowners and he talks them through their forest management more from a forest health perspective. So he'll walk around with you, he'll point things out that might be problematic, or just kind of give you a little more information, and in terms of management for your general goals, which could be, you know, anything, recreation, timber, what have you. So yeah, so we'll be hearing from quite a few DNR folks the rest of this week. Are there any other questions that I missed? Feel free to type them into the chat box. If not, I really appreciate you all joining along for your lunch. Like I said, this is a little bit of an experimental model. I'm hoping that you all like it. At the end of the week, I'll send out a survey, and I would really, really appreciate your thoughts on how this works and how it fits into your schedule, whether or not you want to see more of it, less of it, that kind of thing. But if there's no other questions, I will say goodbye for today. And then we will meet back up tomorrow to talk with Matt about site prep. And I'll be sending out that link tomorrow, probably around 11:30. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, thank you all.